Hello, I'm Tasha Clifton, a manager in the Grants Administration Division at TEA, and I'm going to be walking you through how to complete the ESSER 2 application schedules. Hopefully you've gained access to the TEA login system or TEAL, have obtained access to eGrants, and have already submitted the Applicant Designation and Certification Form, or ADC. The ADC must be submitted in order to access the application. If you've completed these steps, it should be relatively smooth sailing from here. If you've worked on applications for any of the major eGrants like ESSER Consolidated, Perkins, Special Education, or even ESSER 3, the application schedules will be very familiar to you. Over the last couple of years or so, grants administration staff have worked to streamline the applications so that they look and function more consistently. Let's take a closer look at the schedules. The information in this presentation reflects TEA's current understanding of the presentation topics. This presentation does not constitute legal advice. LEAs are advised to seek legal counsel before acting on the information and guidance provided in this presentation. The first schedule that we're going to be taking a look at is the PS 3013 program plan. Part A is the uses of funds. Use this section to indicate planned uses of ESSER 2 funds for your grant program. Select pre-award and/or the school year you have expended or plan to expend funds for each of the listed activities. Select NA if funds will not be spent on an activity. If NA is selected for an item, no other box should be checked. Part B, Uses of Funds, is a continuation of Part A. The same instructions from the previous slide apply. You will select pre-award and/or the school year you have expended or plan to expend funds for each of the listed activities. Part C of the program plan is the LEA needs process. C1 is related to the needs assessment process. Check the box or boxes to indicate the activities you conducted to determine the needs of your LEA that were caused by the pandemic. These should be activities that would not be reimbursed by other fund sources, such as FEMA, the Child Nutrition Program, or the Child Care and Development Block Grant. Select all items that apply. Part 2 of the program plan is the needs prioritization process. Check the box or boxes to indicate how the activities in Part C1 were prioritized. Select all items that apply. If all needs are met with ESSER 2 funds, select the last box. All needs met, no prioritization needed. If this box is checked, no other boxes should be selected. Part D is required assurances. Select the checkboxes to indicate your compliance with each of the listed assurances. PS 3014 is the program narrative schedule. Although it is titled the narrative schedule, you won't actually need to do a lot of writing here. What you'll need to do here is really quite simple. For Part A, pre-award, enter the total amount of ESSER 2 funds to be used for pre-award cost. If you mark the pre-award cost checkbox for any planned uses of funds in Parts A or B on the PS 3013, enter the total amount of pre-award cost for those items here. We ask that you not enter decimals. Enter only a whole number. Once you enter the whole number, no additional text or narrative information is needed. If you are not charging pre-award costs to the grant, enter the word "No" into the text field. Again, there is no need to type any other text in the text box. For Part B, construction and renovation, enter the total amount of ESSER 2 funds to be used for construction and renovation costs. This includes HVAC, air quality, and minor remodeling costs. Refer to the program guidelines for information pertaining to these costs. Remember, prior approval is required to charge these costs to the grant. The form for obtaining prior approval is located on the TEA website. Remember, only enter a whole number here. Once the whole number is entered, no additional information is required in this field. PS 3400, Equitable Access and Participation. You will use this schedule to indicate whether or not any barriers exist to equitable access and participation in your grant program for any of the groups that receive services funded through the grant. If there are no barriers, you will select the first radio button to indicate that there are no barriers. If there are barriers, you will select the second radio button and indicate the group that may potentially experience the barriers by selecting them from the drop-down menu, whether it be students or teachers. You must also provide a brief description of the barrier. For example, transportation or learning disabilities may be potential barriers. Your needs assessment is a great resource for helping you complete this section. Now that we've completed the program schedules, we'll move on to the budget schedules. The first schedule is the BS 6001, Program Budget Summary and Support Schedule. The Program Budget Summary and Support Schedule is a snapshot of all the costs for your grant program by class object code. We're going to take a closer look at the BS 6001 on the next slide. This first slide displays Part 1, Available Funding. Your current award amount will pre-populate on line 3. This next slide shows Part 2, which is a summary of the cost for your grant program by class object code. You will start here by entering the total cost for each class object code, like payroll, supplies and materials, other operating costs, or capital outlay. Line 9 is where you will budget any indirect cost. On this schedule, you must budget for your full award amount, as listed in Part 1. Otherwise, you will receive an error message and you will not be able to submit the application. At the bottom of the screen, you will notice a line in blue, Total Budgeted Cost. That is the total of costs you have entered on the lines above. Immediately below that is Total Funds Available minus Total Cost. This is the difference in your award amount and what you have budgeted. You will want to see a 0 here. If there's an amount listed, you will need to add that amount to one of the line items above. For each class object code where you have budgeted cost on the BS 6001, you will complete the supporting budget schedule. The exception is supplies and materials, as those do not require specific approval. BS 6101 is the payroll schedule. The screenshot you have before you is Part 1 of the schedule. You don't have to do anything here. This part is pre-populated with the dollar amount you entered for payroll cost on the budget summary and support schedule. This is a really nice feature to have. Prior to streamlining the budget schedules, you would have to either go back to the BS 6001 or print a copy of the BS 6001 to see your totals. Currently, it is displayed here for your convenience. Part 2 of the payroll schedule is number and type of positions. This is where you will provide the details regarding payroll positions you're funding by the grant. If your budget costs for these positions in Section A, administrative support or clerical staff, you will enter the number of direct administrative staff for your grant program. This is the only place you will enter a number on this schedule. The other sections require checkboxes. The number included in this section should be a whole number. Section B is for LEA positions. This is where you will identify if you have any LEA positions that meet the descriptions of items on lines 1 through 3. If you do and you're budgeting costs for these positions in the grant, check the box next to the line. Similarly, Section C is for campus level positions that meet the description on lines C1 through C3. And if you're budgeting costs for any of these positions, check the box next to the line. Whether a position is considered a campus level position or an LEA position is defined at the local level by the LEA. TEA does not make this determination. Part 3 of the payroll schedule is where you will budget costs for substitutes, extra duty pay, and benefits. If you're budgeting for these items in your grant program, check the box next to the appropriate line. Part 4 is confirmation of payroll requirements. You are required to check this box to certify that any payroll positions budgeted in the grant are reasonable, necessary, and allowable for the grant program. The second part of the certification is related to the supplement not supplant provision. The statement says that you certify compliance with the federal supplement not supplant provision for the applicable fund source. Supplement not supplant does not apply to this fund source, so you are in compliance if you check this box. The program guidelines that are attached to the grant state that supplement not supplant does not apply. Next up is BS 6201, Professional and Contracted Services. The Professional and Contracted Services schedule will be broken up over the next 2 slides so that we can have a good look at it. Part 1 of the schedule is what is currently displayed. Total professional and contracted services cost at the bottom of the screen will be pre-populated with the amounts that you entered on BS 6001, the Program Budget Summary and Support Schedule for professional and contracted services. The total will appear in the remaining costs that do not require specific approval line initially. If you are budgeting all of the funds for items that do not require specific approval, like utilities or temporary meeting space, you will not need to do anything else. Just save the form and move on to the next schedule. If you are budgeting for items that do require approval, like rental or lease of space in buildings or contracted professional development, you will need to include those costs on lines 1 or 2 as appropriate. These amounts will be deducted from the amount in remaining costs that do not require specific approval. Part 3, Itemized Professional and Consulting Services. For any costs that you identified on Part 1, Line 2, you will need to itemize them here in Part 3. You will enter a brief description of the service, like professional development. The purpose for the service, like professional development for teachers on remote learning. And you will enter a dollar amount. Do not enter specific entity names or brand names, or you will need to submit an amendment if you later decide to use a different brand. Use the Add Item button to add more lines or delete item to remove them if needed. The system will total the items entered in this section and validate it against the dollar amount you entered in Part 1, Line 2. BS 6401, Other Operating Costs. This category of cost is for other operating costs, such as travel, publication and printing, and educational field trips. This is a screenshot of what the entire schedule looks like. Again, the total other operating cost line at the very bottom of the schedule will be pre-populated with the amount you entered on BS 6001. The amount will also appear on the remaining costs that do not require specific approval line. If you only budgeted costs for items that do not require specific approval, like in-state travel for employees, or conference or registration fees for in-state travel for employees, you won't need to do anything else for this schedule. Just save the schedule and move on to the next one. Here's a closer look at the line items on BS 6401. If you do need to budget for items 1 through 6, enter the amount on the line. Line 7, hosting conferences, is unallowable for this grant program. We were unable to customize the grant to disable that line, as this is a generic grant application that's used with multiple grants. Do not budget cost on line 7 or your application will require negotiation. Some items in this list require documentation to be kept on file or submitted to TEA. Please read the details next to the line item. For example, line number 1, out-of-state travel for employees, requires documentation to be kept locally. There are forms available on TEA's website to use for documentation. There will be a link to where the forms are located on the resources page at the end of this presentation. BS 6601, Capital Outlay. This category is for capital assets. All capital outlay requires specific approval. The total capital outlay cost line at the bottom of the screen will be pre-populated with the amount you entered on BS 6001. You will see this amount also in Part 1, Line 3, until you distribute the funds appropriately. Line 1 is for library books and media that are capitalized and controlled by the library. We received questions about this. This would include any library books and media that your district requires you to capitalize and control by the library, regardless of the cost. So please follow the policy for your LEA. Line 2 is for capital expenditures for additions, improvements, or modification to capital assets that increase their value. Line 3 is for furniture, equipment, vehicles, or capitalized software. Budget funds appropriately for each line. When you add amounts on lines 1 and 2, they will reduce the amount on line 3. Construction is a special cost and will need to be approved by Corey. There's a specific process to request approval of those items. Part 2. If you included funds in Part 1, Line 3, you will need to specifically identify those items in Part 2. Request one item per line. Desktop computers and laptops, for example, are different and need to be placed on a separate line. Enter a generic description for each item. No brand names like Apple or Dell should be included. Enter the total number of units for each item, as well as the total cost for all units. For example, if you are purchasing 10 laptops and they are $1,000 each, enter $10,000 for your total cost. Finally, describe how the item will be used to meet the grant objectives. Ideally, who will use it and how it is tied to the grant. For example, laptops for teachers for online instruction. Once you enter all items in Part 2, the system will total the cost and validate it against what is entered on Part 1, Line 3. CS 7000, Provisions, Assurances, and Certifications. This schedule contains links to guidelines, provisions and assurances, debarment and suspension, and lobbying information. Click on the blue buttons on the right side of each line and you will be taken to the documents. Read each of the documents. Select the check boxes on the left. Certifying and submitting indicates you accept and intend to comply with all of the documents. Here are links to some resources that will help you as you complete your grant applications. The first is a link to the TEA Grant Opportunities page. This is where you will access things like the program guidelines and other helpful information like the grant start and end dates, a sample copy of the application, and expenditure reporting deadlines. Next is the General and Fiscal Guidelines. The General and Fiscal Guidelines contain helpful definitions and information on things like reasonable and necessary cost, pre-award cost, administrative cost, and obligation of funds. The next link is where you will find the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook. The Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook is useful for definitions of the class object codes. What is considered professional and contracted services, or capital outlay? There's also information on costs that do not require specific approval here. TEA's justification forms that may be used to document activities on the other operating cost schedule are also accessible through this link. Finally, there's a link to ESSER grant resources, including the forms for obtaining prior approval of construction and renovation costs. If you need assistance as you're completing your grant application, please contact one of the ESSER negotiators listed on the Grants Administration contacts page, which is linked here. Or you may reach us by dialing 512-463-8525.